Today, I'd like to talk about poverty and inequality, just a couple of concepts and um, maybe a few descriptive facts, some features of poverty and inequality in U.S. society, um, and wrap it up with a little bit of a brief explanation for why poverty persists in the United States. We'll start, as I said, with some concepts. So, when we talk about poverty, there are really two ways that social science has tended to look at and evaluate poverty. The first is through the use of a concept that we call absolute poverty. So, absolute poverty is defined as an inability to afford the minimal requirements for sustaining a reasonably healthy existence. So every human organism requires, for example, a certain number of calories every day in order to maintain a healthy metabolic function and to stay alive. If you are unable to afford those resources, that would be considered an example of absolute poverty, or an inability to secure shelter, or the basic medicines and health precautions necessary to survive. So anything that threatens any set of economic or resource access conditions that make it hard to satisfy the things that you need to essentially stay alive, that would be considered absolute poverty. And we call it absolute poverty because it applies to people irrespective of the society that they live in. Relative poverty, which is what we're mostly going to be focusing on in this class, although absolute poverty does happen in the United States, it's much more likely that when we think about and describe and consider in an analytical sense the operation of poverty, we're going to be talking about what we call relative poverty. Relative poverty is an individual's economic situation or a household's economic situation compared to the living standards of the majority in that society. So rather than looking at simply what you have or don't have in order to stay alive and survive, it is where do you stand, or where does a household stand relative to the standard of living in a given society. So, for example, in the United States, somebody might be able to avoid starvation. Somebody might be able to access some fundamental rudimentary housing or other social resources, but compared to the standards of the society itself, might still be experiencing poverty. So it's relative to other households or other individuals in that society. One of the consequences of this poverty, whether we're talking about absolute or relative, and I think it's especially applicable to relative poverty in the United States, is the way in which poverty limits one's access to what we call life chances. Now, life chances are just the extent to which we have access to social resources like food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, things of that nature. Poverty is very important to social scientists. It's of significant interest to sociologists for a variety of reasons, right? So there are some sociologists who are interested in and focus on an analysis of poverty because poverty matters at the individual and household level. Other sociologists look at poverty and inequality because it has consequences at the social level. So societies that are characterized by high degrees of inequality or high rates of poverty, or sometimes both, tend to be very unstable societies. They tend to be organized in ways that perpetuate the inequalities, that sometimes amplify their consequences, and they tend to be very unpleasant places, both overall, but also at the level of how people experience those societies. Poverty, in essence, matters. Just one quick off the cuff example of how poverty matters. In the United States, the richest 1% of Americans live 15 years longer than the poorest 1%. So, um, literally, the length and the amount of life one gets is a function of whether one is rich or poor. To say nothing of the quality of that life, right? There are people, I remember when I was growing up being told that, money can't buy you happiness, which I think is, um, now that I look back on it, really kind of fantastical and weird. Like, why would we have an American dream built around a kind of material definition of comfort, um, if that weren't true, right? I mean, there's a lot of happiness out there in the world that money is not going to buy you, but a certain level of happiness that comes from being secure in your housing, having access to quality food, and being able to stay warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and to be able to go to the doctor and have that thing on your neck looked at, right? All of those sorts of things which come with having access to money. Absolutely make one's life better. So, anyone who tells you that money can't buy you happiness probably has all of the happiness that money is going to get them, and they're thinking about other places where they're still not fully happy. So there's some legitimacy to the idea that money can't buy you all the happiness that is out there, but certainly money is going to be able to buy you a significant chunk of happiness. So let me do a little bit of description here, so we have a sense of what poverty and inequality look like in the United States. And to do that, I'm going to be comparing the United States to countries that are like the United States. So there's a strong value in what we would consider to be an apples to apples comparison. So when we look at the United States and we want to see how the United States stacks up against other countries, it doesn't make sense to compare the United States to all other countries, because there are some countries that are far less developed than the United States. There are countries that aren't like the United States in terms of its technological sophistication or advancement, its fundamental economic structure, which is industrial capitalism or late industrial capitalism. So what we want to do is we want to look at similar countries. And the good news is there's an organization out there in the world called the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It was founded back in the 1960s to sort of foster, economic cooperation and development. But the membership of this organization is nations that are like the United States, technologically advanced, democratic in its governing structures, liberal, lowercase liberal, sort of economic policies, right? So all the other countries that are like the U.S., like Britain and Germany and France and Brazil and Spain, and on and on and on and on. So there are 37 member nations in the OECD. Please don't hold me to that. I think it's 37. It could be 36. But the point here is these are our peer nations. These are the nations that are like the United States. So when we make these comparisons to say, how much poverty is there in the United States, and is that typical of a country like the United States or not, we would look at the OECD average. So, for example, in 2017, the OECD average for poverty was 11%, right? So the average poverty rate, which is the percentage of the population that lives at or below a certain poverty threshold, for the OECD, that was 11%. In the same year for the United States, that was 17.8%. So you can see we're significantly above average when it comes to the poverty rate. For children, in 2017, the OECD average was 13.3%. That's the rate of childhood poverty. In the United States in 2017, it was 20.2. For the elderly, in 2017, the OECD average for the poverty rate among the elderly was 12.1%. In the United States, it was 21.0%. You're not going to be responsible for knowing those numbers, by the way. I don't want anyone to freak out about that. It's just the point here is that to show how far above the average the United States is when it comes to poverty when compared um, to our peer nations. In fact, the United States has the second highest rate of poverty among all the OECD nations. So that's something to just kind of keep in mind. Extreme poverty. Extreme poverty isn't just a colorful phrase. It's actually something that has a concrete definition attached to it. Extreme poverty is measured as the percentage of the poor who are below 1/2 of the poverty line. So if the poverty line in the United States for an individual is, I don't know, $10,000, I should probably look that number up, but again, it changes every year. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the poverty rate for a single adult in the United States is $10,000. So if somebody is living on $5,000 or less, that would be an example of extreme poverty, right? Half of the poverty line. So extreme poverty in the United States is on the rise. It's been increasing for a while, and it continues to increase annually. What else? Excuse me. The regional distribution of poverty is shifting. Historically speaking, poverty has been concentrated in the South and especially the Southeast. That is still the case, but the concentration is shifting. We're finding growing rates of poverty now in places outside the South. Suburban poverty is on the rise, which is kind of interesting if you know the history of the suburbs. Originally in their period of extreme dramatic growth in the first half to the middle of the 20th century, the suburbs were places where people would go to get away from the poverty of cities. And what we've actually seen in recent years is that urban poverty is no longer sort of the driver of poverty rates. It's increasing suburban poverty as cities become places that are more and more expensive over time. And when it comes to race and ethnicity, we see that blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented among the poor. This is true of other oppressed groups as well. So women are overrepresented among the poor. What that means, of course, is that the proportion of those people within poverty is greater than the overall proportion in the population. So blacks represent about 13.1% of the U.S. population, but they are well over 26% of the poor, right, in terms of percentages. So that's what we mean when we talk about being overrepresented among the poor. One of the things that we will talk about in this and subsequent discussions about poverty is the degree to which inequality is kind of structured along various categories, right? So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to look at poverty and inequality in terms of race and ethnicity, how those two things, right, racial and ethnic categorization on one hand and poverty on the other hand, how those two things kind of intersect. We'll look at what we call sex and gender stratification, the degree to which economic inequality and sex and gender categorization will intersect. So these are going to be themes that we focus on. It turns out that inequality, which is a description of the degree to which resources are unequally distributed within society, inequality itself is also unequally distributed, right? That if you are a member of a racial or ethnic minority group, if you're a woman, you are much more likely to be poor than if you're a member of the dominant group or if you're a man. So that's something to keep in mind. One of the other things that we're going to do is look at the distribution, just a raw sort of description of economic inequality is going to look at how how income is concentrated in um, um, groups toward the top of the distribution. So the way we do this is we look at what we call quintiles. We take all of the households in the United States, and let me say something very quickly about our use of households as opposed to individual level data. The reason why social scientists like sociologists and economists use things like household data rather than individual level data is because household data captures how most people and um, um, how most of the economic decision making and the economic activity happens in American society. So a married couple, um, one of whom earns $100,000 a year, the other of whom earns $50,000 a year. More often than not, the overwhelming majority of the time, that married couple is going to pool those income dollars together, right? And the household income would be $150,000 a year. It isn't that I can imagine maybe somewhere it might be, but for most households in the United States, the person who's earning $100,000 in that couple relative to the person who's earning half of that doesn't get twice as much food at dinner, doesn't get twice as much space on the couch, doesn't get to set um, um, make the decision making about what shows they're going to watch on TV twice as much, right? The household operates as an entity. It's not within that household. You don't have the person earning half as much as the other person taking showers that are only half as long, or only having half as much clothing, right? It isn't that. So individuals earn income, but households spend that income. And households capture every possible variation. A household could be a person living by themselves, in which case you've got a one-person household, and that captures that individual level data because that's how the economic decision-making and economic activity is occurring. In another instance, you might have a cohabitating couple, not married, but sharing their income, sharing their rent, sharing their electric bill, and things of that nature. That would be also a household. A married couple with children living in a house is a household. A married couple retired whose children have moved away is a household, right? So household level data captures sort of the most typical set of experiences and set of activities that we find within a given society. So we will look a lot at household level data. Now, one of the ways that we can see how equally or unequally things are distributed across households is to take all of the households in the United States and divide them up into equal chunks, equal shares. Usually what we do is we use 20% segments of the total population of households. So the total number of households in 2019 in the United States was about 128 and a half, almost 129 million households, right? So not the total population is well over 300 million people, but the total number of households is about 128, 129 million. So we take that number and we divide it up into equal chunks, and we call those chunks quintiles, right? Quintile, 20%, 1/5, right there you get the quint. If we were to divide that population up into 4 equally sized chunks, we would have quartiles, right? A quartile being a 1/4 or a 25% segment of a population. We could do deciles, right? 1/10. We could do percentiles, which would be 1/100th. But for a variety of reasons, quintiles are the general measure that allow us to get a really rough approximation of how equally or unequally income is distributed within a population, in this case, the population of households. So in 2019, the median household income in the United States was $68,703. Again, unless I tell you otherwise, the precise numbers are probably not anything that you need to worry about. I will tell you if you need to know a number. Otherwise, I think it's enough to know just sort of the ballpark figures, because again, these numbers change every year, sometimes a lot, sometimes very slightly. So there's really no point in there's no point in me making you memorize what things were like in 2019, given that it's now 2022, and things will be a little bit different. So, but again, have a general sense of what the midpoint is. And there's a reason, by the way, when we talk about household income, there's a reason we don't look at average, and we instead tend to focus on median, because the median, not to turn this into a class on statistics, but the median is a very robust measure of central tendency. It doesn't tend to be affected very much by outliers. If you have 10 houses in a suburban street, and each household has a family where the household income is $100,000, then your average income is going to be $100,000, and the median, which is the midpoint, is also going to be $100,000. If the house on the corner is purchased by Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or some of these other incredibly wealthy individuals, the average income of that 10 block or the 10 house stretch of houses on that suburban street has suddenly skyrocketed into the hundreds of millions of dollars, or the tens of millions of dollars at the very least. But the median has stayed the same, right? The median won't budge an inch because the midpoint is still 100,000. So because it is less sensitive to outliers and extreme values on either end of a distribution, economists and social scientists broadly, especially sociologists, we like to look at the median as opposed to the average. So the median household income is around $68,700 a year. So when we look at what's happened with the median income over the say the last 40 or 50 years, we see something very, very interesting, which is when you adjust for inflation. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But when you adjust for inflation, median household income hasn't really gone up very much at all since 1973. So there's a very interesting sort of graphical representation of this in any number of different places. You could look this up, but you could actually go back and see this in some of the material that's linked in the media folder, the media and videos folder for Module 3. You'll see some of these charts and diagrams that illustrate this quite starkly, sort of vividly. So the median household income hasn't really gone up very much since the early 1970s. In the meantime, the price of almost everything except for food has gone up quite dramatically, especially things like healthcare and housing. And so what we see is, in effect, the purchasing power of the median income in the United States has actually been declining, right? So even just keeping up with the ability to have the same standard of living that people had back in the 1970s requires you to be making much more than the median household income. So that's a real issue. It's a real issue because, and here's a number that you should probably remember, the United States economy, right? So the total amount of economic activity that occurs in the United States in a given year, about 71% of that is consumer spending, right? And when consumers have less money to spend, that's bad not just for those individuals who don't have the money to spend, it's bad for the economy overall because the economy is driven by consumption, people buying things, people buying products, people buying services. When the ability for people to purchase goods and services goes down because the value of their earnings is not keeping pace with the increasing costs of those goods and services, then you're going to see an actual decline. So even though the number itself isn't really declining, the fact that it isn't growing means that at the end of the day, it's kind of starting to drag. It's starting to lag behind, and that's why it's important to look at this in what we call inflation-adjusted dollars. When you look at it in whole dollars, right, a dollar today and a dollar back in 1973, that's not a very meaningful comparison, because a dollar today in 2022 buys a whole lot less than what a dollar purchased back in 1973. You've undoubtedly heard, parents or grandparents talking about, how much they used to be able to get for a dollar, or how little things cost back in the past. But again, it's because the purchasing power of the dollar has not kept pace in a whole dollar sense with the rising cost of goods and services, what we call inflation. So there are formulas. You don't need to know any of them. There are plenty of online inflation calculators that you could just plug values in. And I encourage you guys to play around with that just to get a sense of how much inflation has occurred over the last, say, 50 years or 60 years or 70 years. And look at what a dollar buys today relative to what it used to buy back in, I was born in 1966. So looking at what a dollar purchased in 1966 compared to what it purchases today, it's pretty stark. It's pretty dramatic. So back to household income. So we want to look at these 20% segments of the population of households. We want to look at these quintiles, and we want to say, all right, how much of all of the income earned in the United States in 2019 goes to the first quintile, that first 20% chunk of households? In a condition of perfect equality, 20% of households would earn 20% of income, right? There wouldn't be a difference across these 5 quintiles because we would have, equality. So 20% of the households would earn 20% of the income. And the next 20% of the households would also earn 20% of the income, and so on and so forth. But that's not the case, obviously. So what we want to do is we want to say, all right, so how much of the income earned in the United States in 2019 went to the bottom 20% of households? And that would be an income range of $0 to about $28,000, again, in 2019. The percentage is 3.1%. It's pretty low, right? So 20% of households earning 3.1% of the income. The second quintile, again, a 20% segment of the population, taking home 8.3% of the income. The third quintile, 20% of households taking home 14.1% of the income. And I'd like you to pause here and note this, right? We're now talking about 60% of households in the United States. Clearly a majority of households in the United States. And between them, they're only taking home about 26% of all of the income. So 60% of households earning about 25% of the total income that's being earned in the United States. Yeah, she's going to get out of here in just a second. Man, she's a better jumper than that. I don't know what's going on. All right, so once we get to the fourth quintile, that's where we see the first 20% of households earning more than 20% of the income. They take home a total of 22.7% of all the income earned back in 2019. And then, of course, the top 20% is where we see the real effect of this inequality. The top 20% of households in the United States take home 51.9% of all the income. That's a lot, right? They take home over half. Only 20% of the population of households, but they're taking home half of the total, more than half of the total income earned in a given year. If you just look at the 95th percentile, right? So I said percentiles would give you a finer grained sort of analysis and description. Top 5% of households, 5% of households in the United States in 2019 took home 23% of the total income. So we have an income distribution in this country that is massively skewed toward a very, very small population of people at the top. And for a whole variety of reasons, that's something to be concerned about, right? It's obviously going to have an effect on the people who don't have the material resources to get the things they need to survive, but it's also bad for the economy because 5% of the population sitting on almost a quarter of all the income, or 20% of the population taking home over half of all the income, there aren't enough people in those relatively small percentages. There aren't enough people to drive an economy that is, again, 71% consumer spending. There just aren't enough consumers in raw numbers. A healthy economy is one in which you have a really, really large, robust middle class, and they're out there spending their money. You have a relatively large, robust working class with enough money left over that they can also do some consumption. Since the 1980s, what this country has done is found ways through policy decisions and tax policies especially of channeling more and more money into the hands of a smaller and a smaller and smaller group of people, and then scratching their heads and wondering why the economy is so slow. It's because the people who would be out there spending all of their money just don't have it anymore. If you look at the value of the minimum wage, right? The minimum wage has, since 2009, been $7.25 an hour. That's the federal minimum wage. Some states have higher minimum wages, but that hasn't changed, right? So $7.25 an hour, 2009, $7.25 an hour today. That's a recipe for economic disaster, because those people who are earning something at or near the minimum wage, they don't have as much money to spend in terms of purchasing power. They have exactly the same number of dollars per hour, $7.25, but the purchasing power of that $7.25 today is not what it was back in 2009. So that's why it's an issue of concern. All right, last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll wrap this up, is why this persists, right? So why do we have an ongoing, persistent problem with inequality? And there are a lot of arguments out there. A lot of people will point to cultural deficiencies or poor decision making by the poor, which is a kind of a very inelegant attempt to sort of blame the victim. But there are really four reasons why poverty persists. And the first and most significant chunk of the explanation is that we have an economic system in the United States that creates income and wealth disparities. We've got just any number of different policies that make it easier for people who have money to increase the amount of money they have, while at the same time making it harder for people who don't have money to find ways to earn more money, right? So the again, the stagnated median household income, stagnated wages, decline in unions, right? A whole bunch of policies that have resulted in taking the productivity of the American worker, which is very, very impressive, right? American workers are about 75% more productive today than they were back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when this divergence kind of begins. But the problem is, of course, the gains, the economic rewards of that increased productivity have gone almost exclusively to people at the very top of the income distribution, and those benefits have not found their way into the pockets of people in the middle and people at the bottom. So that is the main reason why we have a persistent problem with inequality in this country, is we have an economic system that creates inequality, right? So we haven't changed our economic system, so we're not going to get rid of inequality, really at the end of the day, probably until we do. The second reason why we have persistent inequality is that in many ways, inequality creates social and economic benefits, right? The presence or the persistence of poverty serves a particular set of interests. So, for example, employers who are looking for low-wage labor will find it in a society of people who are not making enough money to get by. They'll take whatever job at the end of the day that you can give them. I think one of the things that really illustrates this nicely is that the vast majority of people who work for Walmart, which is the largest private sector employer. Well, it might be Amazon now, but Walmart is the largest retailer. or was until very, very recently. The vast majority of people who work at Walmart qualify for some forms of federal subsistence, some federal aid. It might be SNAP, right? The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, what we call food stamps. It might be housing subsidies. It might be other kinds of benefits that are given to low-income households or low-income individuals, which means that the taxpayers are essentially subsidizing Walmart's low wages and Amazon's low wages and McDonald's low wages, right? A lot of these companies that pay workers incomes that are closer to the bottom, closer to the minimum wage, they are being massively subsidized by taxpayers, which include, of course, the employers who work for these companies. So in essence, in some respects, workers are paying taxes to allow these large corporations to pay the workers relatively low incomes. So that's another reason why poverty persists, is because there are all kinds of benefits to certain groups of people within society that come from that. There are people who have jobs because other people are poor. Social workers, law enforcement, people who are in charge of dispersing federal benefits to those people who qualify for them, right? There are lots of different people who have jobs because other people are poor. My own research on homelessness is made possible by the fact that there are a lot of other people out there who are poor. I've taken, their experiences, their stories, their circumstances, and I've parlayed that into an academic career. And they're not getting a check from me, right? I'm the beneficiary of being able to sort of share their stories with other audiences. But at the end of the day, part of my career is a function of the fact that there are poor people out there that I can study and conduct an analysis of, and then share that with other scholars. So those are kind of things on the structural side. I'm going to post a piece in the Readings of Interest folder by a guy named Herbert Gans, in which he talks about quite extensively about the social benefits of poverty, the positive functions of what he calls the undeserving poor. So that's on the structural side. On the cultural side, the ideologies. Now ideologies are tricky. They're kind of you can think of them as beliefs. So remember, we talked about beliefs as an element of non-material culture. Ideologies are also positions that are kind of bound up in values, right? So the values that make certain courses of action seem appropriate and proper, or other courses of action inappropriate and improper. That's a part of the equation here as well. So when we look at the ideologies or the values that underlie inequality and our ability to sort of justify it or excuse it or explain it away, would kind of be twofold. The first is what we call competitive individualism. If you ever see a word that ends with ISM, that usually implies or connotes that that's a belief. So competitive individualism is a belief that success comes to those people who work the hardest and who have the best and most valuable abilities. And the implication, of course, is that the people who are not successful are lazy and they don't really have anything of value to offer society, right? So that's part of what underlies the ideology of meritocracy, which is, the idea that society's inequality reflects the relative value of what people are contributing. Obviously, the United States likes to, and other countries, I don't want to just sort of call this an American problem specifically, but the United States is not a meritocracy. We have people living off of inherited wealth, right? And as long as that's the case, you can't make an argument, at least I don't think with a straight face, you can't make an argument that people who are rich because they deserve to be rich. Paris Hilton is a great example of somebody who is rich, who really hasn't done anything to merit the economic circumstances that she finds herself in. Her grandfather, who started a line of hotels, arguably merited the financial success that he had, but she hasn't, right? And again, not to sort of single her out, but she's a kind of a famous example. So that's one thing, right? The idea that success is a function of hard work and the value of one's contributions, which means then if people are successful, they're going to be very, very likely to assume that they deserve to be successful. And they're also going to be likely to assume that people who aren't don't. Which means it's going to be very hard to convince them to change policies or to contribute to a restructuring or reorganization of how we distribute resources. And that's obviously going to be a problem. The flip side of that, and the other ideological dimension to this, is what we call the culture of poverty. And what happens with the culture of poverty is kind of interesting. Now, the culture of poverty idea itself, which is explained in the chapter, I think that has some validity to it. This is a concept that was introduced by an anthropologist back in the 1970s named Oscar Lewis. His argument was that people who are in poverty conditions will adopt particular patterns of behavior or practices that allow them to adapt and survive their poverty conditions. And then the argument is that some of those adaptations, while they allow you to sort of survive poverty in the short term, don't really position you well to escape poverty or to be able to transition out of poverty. The problem with this concept is that a lot of people have taken this idea of the culture of poverty and said that people are poor because of the choices they're making, right? That these choices and behaviors are the cause of poverty. But what is actually the case, of course, is that they're a consequence of poverty. But as long as people believe that poor people are poor because they've made bad choices, and you couple that with the idea that successful people are successful because they're smart and hardworking, you've got a kind of cognitive obstacle to overcome if you're ever going to resolve the issue of poverty. And until that actually happens, it's going to be very, very easy for existing policies that create or help to maintain the inequality that we see when we look at the United States are going to be very, very hard to dismantle. It's going to be very hard to create a system in which that is not the case in the long term. All right, so that kind of takes us up to the end of what I'd like to talk about. If any of these things are not clear to you, as always, feel free to reach out and ask questions. Let me know, and if it is crystal clear to you, then I will take full credit for that. In the meantime, of course, take care, and I will talk to you next time.